Welcome to Code Club. Here we are again with a selection of gophers from the Bitfield Institute of Technology. Josh is with me. Hello.
Hey, how you doing? Oh, and that's my cat, also with me.
Hello, Josh's cat. Nice to have you both with us. Rakesh is also here. How are you doing?
I'm good, John. I'm good. I'm back.
Welcome back. Thiago is here, of course. Thibaut is also here. Greetings.
Yeah. Hello, everybody.
Ça va?
Parfait.
And shout out to Jumana, who wants to be here, but she's at work, so she's going to watch the video later, so hello to her. Tom would also like to be with us, but he is sick, so I'm sending him good wishes and get well soon. Let's talk about options. So this is quite fun. It's maybe not a sexy topic, but, well, I can think of sexier topics, but it's pretty important, isn't it? We're all having to deal with options at some point when we're writing Go packages or even just using other people's packages. Josh, maybe I can start with you. Like, when I say options, what kind of thing does that conjure up for you? We could think about configuration, couldn't we? So, like, in general, if you have some package or tool, there'll be some different ways to use it. There'll be some inputs and some configuration and maybe some options. I think we all kind of throw these terms around in a loose way, don't we? But can we distinguish between them a little bit? Like, is there a distinction between options and configurations for you?
So are you saying, like, sometimes I'll use a library and there'll be a function that has like you can pass in like an options struct or something?
Yeah, that kind of thing, definitely.
Okay. No, that's a good point. The way people use configuration and all these terms actually confuses me. That's actually something I've thought about recently. When people say configuration, I don't know. It's unclear to me that they're always using it in the same way.
Yeah, well, how about this? I mean, I think maybe I think of it this way, like there are some things, as the library author, I need configuration. I need you to give me some information about what to do. Some of that is going to be compulsory, like if I'm talking to the cloud, maybe I need your cloud credentials, API key or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not quite an option for me, because it's not optional, right? You
Right.
have to supply it. On the other hand, there are some things which maybe govern how I do things.
Yeah.
Type,
So like on the, I don't know if this is an example, but I've been using the file system for a project, and you can pass a bunch of numerical flags when you're like opening a file.
yeah,
Is that an example of options? Because I think if you don't, I don't think you have to pass anything, and then it just defaults to whatever.
yeah, I think that's right. So yeah, that makes sense to me. So I kind of think of options as being something where you can supply them or not. Maybe there's a default for whatever it is, or maybe it's just something extra and optional.
Mhm.
Thibaut, I know you have at least one package that
Yeah,
I know about which has options, right?
yeah. Basically, one example for me of option is like if you've got a server and you get to set up a port. Sometimes you will set up a default port, but you will let your user be able to customize this port for whatever reason he has.
Yeah,
So in fact, you're giving him the ability to override your default config.
yeah. That's a great example. So we're often writing servers of some kind, aren't we? And if it's a network server, it probably wants to listen on some port. So maybe that's configuration because we need to pass it. Maybe it's not configurable. You know, maybe it has to listen on some port because that's its job. But maybe we don't care. We just need to know what it is. So maybe we pass it in as an option, and as you say, maybe there's a default. Maybe we just choose a random port, right? So that can make sense. So, you know, we're almost always writing code that needs to take some kind of option. So we have a bunch of choices, don't we, about how to do that? Thiago, in your programs where you have things which are optional, what kind of ways have you used of letting the user specify options?
Using flag with
Yeah,
default configuration.
that's a great one. Yeah, flags are important. Command line flags, I guess you mean.
Yep.
And in terms of, you know, that implies there's a CLI tool, doesn't it? And maybe the user specifying their config and options by a bunch of different, we can imagine environment variables, command line flags, command line parameters, maybe config files.
Yep.
Also possible, isn't it? But given all of these different things, we need some way of getting them into the package, don't we? So how can we do that? So again, Thiago, if you can think of an example of somewhere where you take an option, how do you pass it into your package? Or do you pass it in? You know, is it a variable that you set, or?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people using environment variables, and I kind of like that because it's easy to set. Like the executor, the people that's calling the function, the module, or whatever, just need to set an environment, and it's doesn't matter where you are running it. It's pretty simple to set the variables. I really like it.
Yeah, that's one thing, is that it sounds like you're saying the library itself could just look in the program's environment and grab an option out of there.
Yeah.
Which is fine, isn't it? But maybe we don't want to hardwire the fact that it's in the environment. Maybe we would like to be able to just take it in some way from the user, you know. Maybe we're running on an embedded device, you know, which has no environment or whatever. So let's make this concrete, shall we? So let's do some coding. So let's try and write something which has options, and we'll look at different ways that we could supply them, and we might be able to come to some conclusions about what we like and don't like. Suppose we write a package, let's say, we might write a package called greeter. I like things which say hello. So let's just suppose we had a function greet, and it just prints out hello, let's say. This is always good to start with something relatively simple, isn't it? We're going to complicate it further, no doubt, but let's see how far we can get. So we won't worry about a test for now because we're just playing, but we all understand that in real life we would actually be writing tests for this, wouldn't it? We're all right to live in Fantasyland for the duration of Code Club, aren't we? So let me make a CLI tool which will use this. It's going to be a main.go. So let me see if I can do this. So I want to import my greeter package, don't I? Rakesh, maybe you can help me with this. What should I do if I want to use my greet function here?
Oh, I never seen this CMD. Let me try. So now we have this greeter. Now we need to call the method on the greeter. We could say greeter dot.
Yeah, it's going to be greeter dot something because it's in that package, isn't it? That's right.
Yes.
And let me split screen for you. Save us remembering things. We can just see them.
Okay, greeter dot greet.
Yep. Sounds good. Doesn't take any arguments, does it?
No. We want to see that. Okay, when you start printing the statement in the greet method, so we don't need to write a print statement that should print hello.
We're ready to try it out, aren't we? So at the moment there are no options. That's the kind of library that we all like to write. It's very straightforward.
Yeah, you need a Go init mode.
Thank you. That's just a little bit of paperwork that we need to get done. So brilliant. All right, happy with that. I'll see you next week, everybody. Oh no, well, okay. Let's do a little more. So what could we do here in terms of options, Rakesh? What might we want to make optional, for example?
Yeah, we could say we could make greet to say a name next to hello.
Yeah, that sounds good, doesn't it? Let's actually pass in the name to greet. We can take a string parameter here, and we can put that in our output, can't we?
Yeah.
So far so straightforward, so let's see if that works. Brilliant. All right, let's do a new line. So this isn't an option, is it? This is a parameter. It's not configuration either, is it? It's just input.
No.
So a good way to think about this is to ask, is there a sensible default for this? Clearly, I don't think there is for that. You could have a default name, but it doesn't make much sense. So this is input. So suppose we had an option. Suppose we made the greeting optional, right? So one way we could do that is we could pass in the greeting too. Let's do that. So let's put that in. That should have no effect whatsoever, should it?
No.
Great. Happy with that. But here's the thing. So as the user of this greeter package, super useful, I may not want to have to specify a greeting. Maybe I'm happy with the default greeting. So the answer to that question for the greeting is there is a sensible default, isn't there? We could default to hello.
Yeah, we could use hello as a default greeting unless the user specifies it to be something else.
Yeah, exactly. So the problem is I have to pass it now, don't I? I can't just leave that out. Because if I do, it just won't compile, because it'll say too few arguments. I've made a rod for my own back, really, haven't I? I said I made that configurable, but now I have to configure it. This is annoying, isn't it? So Bryan joined us. Hello, Bryan.
Hello.
Good to have you back. What could we do here? Can we start thinking about this problem of how can we have something which you can supply if you want, but you can also not supply it if you don't want?
How about setting some the default value as an static variable, a default variable here, which gets overwritten if user passes the data into the code?
So you're saying maybe
a variable which has default value in it. Given if the variable does come through the greet, it gets replaced with the one which being passed, or the default greeting should
something like this.
Yeah, something like that.
Fine. Let's see if that works. Yes. Okay. So Bryan, if you're still with us,
I am.
how can I, we have the ability, we have the default, but we don't have the ability to configure it yet. So how could we configure this? If I wanted to use a different greeting, let's say hola, how could I do that?
I was assuming we'd use variadic. parameters here, but
we could definitely do that. So just explain what you mean by variadic for anybody who doesn't know.
they're optional. You can specify 0 or more of a certain type to be passed to the function.
Yep.
If I remember correctly, they have to be the last thing in the function signature.
Yeah. So it would look like something like this.
Yes. Which is basically telling you 0 or more string.
Yeah. So those 3 dots mean I can supply any number I want. So I have to supply this one, there's no dots. But this one is variadic, by which we mean I could supply 0 to n of it. So I don't have to pass anything here, so this should compile. Let's just check. Fine. Okay, not quite what we want, but this is definitely along the right lines. So let's when we take variadic parameters, we sort of receive them as a slice inside the function, don't we? So we could say, let's assume that there always is exactly 1, and we'll use the first one. Let's try this. Panic. So index out of range 0 with length 0. So it's saying you tried to access the first element of the slice and there are no elements, so that makes no sense. So it's going to be rather annoying here now, isn't it, that I'm going to have to say something like, if len greeting is greater than 0, do this, otherwise use the default greeting, let's say. So we could do that, but it doesn't feel right, does it?
What about using a struct with like a default that would sort of move the knowledge of the function out into the caller, which maybe isn't desirable?
Yeah, this sounds good. Dave joined us. Hello, Dave.
Hi, with audio.
Yeah. So we're accumulating a few different ideas here, aren't we? We've got a global variable, we've got variadic parameters, we've got a struct is another option. So let's just try and knock out the ones that we don't really like. So I don't really like the variadic thing for a bunch of reasons. One, because if I don't get anything, I have to handle that. And what if I get multiple things? I mean, that's a bit weird, isn't it? You could send 3 different greetings. Which one should I use? It's just, we feel like we would like something, we would like a way to say you can either supply exactly one of these or exactly none of them. Well, guess what? We don't have that. So we could use a different language, which does have that, but we know that's not the answer. So let's see what we can do. So if we don't, let's go back to this global variable idea for a moment. So right now this works, but it's not configurable. So how could we configure it? Thibaut, we can access this variable, can't we? We can set it.
Yeah, we can set it directly in the main.
So we could do that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's working. So this is quite nice, but can you think of any problems about this? As an expert in Go concurrency, which I know you are.
Yeah, the big issue would be that we would have to protect this variable using mutexes if we have multiple Go routines trying to access it concurrently.
Yeah, suppose this was a server of some kind and we were returning this greeting as a web page.
Yeah.
First of
we
all,
would have some, yeah,
we wouldn't want to share this variable amongst all the different people who
yeah,
are using the greeting service, are we? Because if one person sets it, they set it for everybody, and we can think of data race issues around
yeah,
that, and we could protect it with a mutex, as you say, but that doesn't solve the problem of like it should be personal to me, not global for everybody. So that isn't quite going to work. So what could we do instead?
what I've done in one of my packages to make another function, in fact, that would input both parameters.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, have the greet function call this second function with the default value.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like we're saying we've got some state which can be changed. So, and it's global. So global mutable state, we already feel instinctively is bad, and we know it's bad for various technical reasons. So how can we make the state not global? Any thoughts?
By passing as a command line arguments to the program.
Yeah, but what would it look like from the point of view of package greeter? See, Richard is with us. Hello, Richard.
Morning, everyone.
Nice to have you back on board. Suppose we had some struct here. Would that help? Could we put this greeting value inside a struct?
I suppose you could, and then maybe you could write different creation methods. I don't know. Just kind of thinking out loud again.
Yeah, let's do that. Suppose we had some type greeter. This could be our server object, couldn't it? Like if we think about this generically as a server, it's some kind of struct that has state, and we know what that is. So we've got a string field here. We can't set it yet because this is only a type definition. But we could set it over here, couldn't we? So we could say something like g equals greeter.greeter. Bike shared the type names later. We'll just create an empty literal. And now we could set g.greeting, couldn't we? Richard, does this make sense to you?
Give me a little bit of time. I'm trying to get back into the swing of things.
Yeah, no worries. We're all putting our brains together, aren't we, to
Yep.
try and think through this. So I'm saying instead of just setting a global package level variable greeting, I first of all created an instance of this greeter struct, and it's mine, isn't it? It's local to me, and no one else can see this. So I can quite happily set fields on it, and this doesn't affect anybody else. So we solved our globalness problem, right?
Oh, yep. Sorry, this is the same thing we did on the Jekyll server build project that I was working on.
So yeah, that's a good example. So just say a word or two about that.
Oh, so we created for our test scripts. We created a runner function and a new runner function, and like here we created I guess a module on it where we would just use the dot notation and add.
Yeah, a method, I think you're saying, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So your particular project is a server configurator, if you like, for installing packages and dependencies and so forth. And to do that, you need to run Unix commands, and that that ability to run things has some state, doesn't it? Like it has a standard input and standard output, for example. So instead of making those global, because you're a good engineer, you put them inside a runner struct, and now you can change the state. You can create a runner, you can set its options, and then you can use it. So that's great. So I think you already answered my next question before I asked it, which was how does this play with greet now? So how does greet get this information? It's no longer a global, is it? So you said method, which was exactly right. What exactly do we mean by that? Jump in, anyone who knows. Don't want to make Richard feel too on the spot. Or at least rotate the spotlight around a bit, right?
I think a method is in any type of sort of data type any sort of data type that can run a function on itself, basically.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, we we could have passed the greeter in here. Let's just call it G. It's a greeter, and then we can reference g.greeting, and we could pass that in here. That works, doesn't it? But it's a little awkward to have to pass that G, and as you said, Josh, we can just, by making this a method, all we're really doing is moving this parameter from over here on the right to over here on the left. Everything else is exactly the same, and now this just becomes g.greet, doesn't it? So it's like saying the G isn't just another parameter to greet.
It's missing one thing, Sensei.
Yeah, what's that?
The greeter, it's going to be a pointer, right?
Does it though?
Oh no, because we are not changing anything, right? Yeah, does it?
So yeah, I mean that's exactly the right question. We should always be asking when you have a method like this: is this a greeter value or is it a pointer? And you also answered that question in this case, which is no, we don't need a pointer because greet does not modify the G.
And I have a question too. So typically, like in a library, you know, a lot of them are kind of set up this way. You'll have the struct, and then it'll be usually like a function called new.
Mm-hmm.
that sets up the struct and returns it.
Yeah.
What's the advantage of, why do they all do it that way? Because it's basically doing the same thing you're already doing there in main. Is it just a cleaner way to do it, or?
The difference is about where information is leaked. So if you have an object and you call a method on it and say, build yourself, you don't know anything about the implementation of that, and the interface then is simpler. Whereas at the moment, if you look at it, our main function, it needs to know a lot of stuff about the internals of the greeter package. And if we have a new thing, then we don't know anything about it. And then when our greeter application becomes so powerful that it needs an enormous database behind it.
Yeah, which it will.
Well, yeah, obviously will, because we need to read everybody.
Yeah.
Then that implementation can change and the client package doesn't need to alter.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. But there's an even more fundamental thing, isn't there, which Josh was sort of getting at, which is kind of like, so we didn't do the default greeting bit here, or we lost that functionality, didn't we? So if I don't set a greeting at all, I still want this to work. So actually that's not acceptable, is it? So I definitely don't want to have to make the user do this paperwork every time they have to set the greeting. They may as well have just passed it as a parameter to greet, mightn't they? So we need to, so if we have some defaults, we're kind of saying you can't just create a greeter struct yourself because you might forget to set things on it, and we need to. So Josh mentioned new, so let's say we have a new function which constructs a greeter and returns it. So we can do that, can't we? So we could just return an empty greeter. That's okay. And now instead of using a struct literal here, I'm just calling greeter.new, and that's a function, but it gives me my G, and then I can call greet on it. That makes sense, Josh, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I guess you're saying, so the important advantage is you're not relying on the user to set it up correctly. Basically, you get control over that.
Exactly.
I don't know if I understood, and sorry, I don't know your name from your username, what your explanation, I'm not sure I understood that explanation of the other advantage.
Well, we're not quite there yet, so I'll ask Dave to hold that for a second until we've got there. I just want to take a moment to tell you about a series of ebooks I'm writing for Go beginners called For the Love of Go. In Book 1, Fundamentals, I show you how to write tests in Go and how to build programs test first. In Book 2, Data, I tell you all about variables and values in Go and data types like slices and structs. If you're new to programming or just new to Go, I'll show you everything you need to know to start building fun and useful projects. Go to bitfieldconsulting.com/books and enter Code Club at the checkout to get 25% off now. So I missed out something here, didn't I? Which was that I didn't configure the default greeting. So let's do that, because we can do that now. So this should work, shouldn't it? Excellent. Okay, and now let me customize the greeting. I can still do that.
If you're going to have a new, why would you not pass the greeting into the new?
Yep, you can definitely do that. This is
Sorry,
working.
what was the question? I didn't get.
The question was, if I'm just going to set the greeting, why not just pass the greeting into new? I think that was it, wasn't it? One answer to that might be, well, I don't want to make them have to pass the empty string when they're happy with the default. That's one thing, and I could make it variadic and so forth here, but we've already decided that's not exactly ideal. So this feels kind of okay, doesn't it, in the sense that we always think about two types of user. There's the standard user, if you like. They don't need any special options, they're happy with whatever. It works for them and they have minimum paperwork. But the power user, they can set their power greeting, and that works. So this is kind of nice, but you can imagine maybe there's more things here. And so suppose we customize the message as well. Add a little message onto the end of it. So we might say, hello so-and-so, message, we can do this, can't we? So let's see what happens. Okay, this is looking good, and I can customize the message in the same way, can't I?
I've got a quick question.
Yep.
Maybe if we wanted a message reader that maybe greeted us in German,
Yep.
would even set up an interface to say what needs to be implemented, and then we could create a German greeter the same way, and then any message or any functions that you needed to operate on a greeter could click either one, because it's as long as they implement the interface. Is that how interfaces are designed to work in Go?
Yeah, I can't hear you very well, but I think you're getting at the idea of interfaces, aren't you? Which is right, but we're also not quite ready for that yet, and we're sort of exploring different ways for users to be able to give options to our package, and that's definitely one way, but maybe not the most convenient for them. So let's sort of expand our imagination and say maybe we have 10 things that we want to set here. This is kind of annoying, and then imagine that we're writing a function that works with greeters, and maybe people can pass things to us. And now we don't want to have to take 15 parameters here, do we? So somebody mentioned config struct earlier, and this is something that probably most of us have come across, isn't it? So, Bryan, have you used a config struct that you pass to someone else, or have you written a package which takes one?
I have not.
Well, you can guess what it looks like, can't you? Let's say, suppose we're saying instead of having individual fields for all our different options, we'll just have one field called config, and it's this config type, so that's another struct, so structs within structs. And now that's relatively straightforward. You can just do that, and if I take these out for a minute, we just need to update these, don't we? We can do that.
Why do config and not just config? If you did just config, promotion would happen, right? And then you just ignore the reference.
Yeah, that's right. But when we looked at embedding and promotion in a previous code club, we said it can kind of lead to confusing code, and you can see why, because we could reference a field greeting which is not actually on that struct, and people would look at it and go, well, where is it? You have to magically know that it's in some other struct. So suppose, that kind of thing can be super useful, but for this, it's maybe not what we want. So let's suppose we have this. So now I want to customize my config over here, don't I? So I could do that because I can give a greeter.config literal, and I can put these two things in it, and I can uncomment them, and these are just field names now. Okay, does this work? Yes, that's really good. So, Josh, how do you feel about this config struct passing thing here? Because, this feels like progress, doesn't it? But are we doing this the right way? Are there problems with this?
Let's see. So you have it set up where you would get a defaults, which is something we wanted, and then I don't know. I guess I don't have the insight of what would be the problem here.
Well, it's all right, isn't it? Lots of packages work exactly this way, and there's nothing wrong with it as such, except that we have to have this extra type, which is just really for config. And
right.
The thing is, if we have the entire config struct that we can set, that's easy. But suppose we just have little bits, like you could imagine 3 different flags to the command line tool which set each of these fields, and now it's kind of a pain for us to build up that config struct. Why are we doing all that paperwork? Should be over in the package, right? We really want to make this as zero touch as possible. So we could imagine maybe there's lots of complicated ways we could do this. But
maybe read the JSON file.
Yeah, absolutely. That information could come from a dozen different places, couldn't it? But the question is, how do we get it across the middle of the screen here from the user into the package? And we could pass a JSON file to the package, but I not too crazy about that idea. There's enough JSON in my life already, I feel, without adding more of it. Has anybody heard of functional options? Or know what that means?
Mm-mm.
I saw it when I was working on my package,
Yeah.
because you mentioned to me an article from Dave Cheney on
Yeah.
this. And basically, if I remember well, it's a way of passing a function that's got a type receiver on it, and therefore can access the various configuration fields
Yeah.
of the struct.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
the drawback is that you have to loop on all the functional options that you're passing to the functions in
Yeah,
order to execute them on the struct.
that's right. So let's back up a moment and just clarify what we're talking about here. So suppose, what we could imagine is something like, suppose you didn't have a config struct, which is a pain. One thing about this is, if you wanted to add new fields, for example, you changed the type, and therefore you possibly broke people's code and so forth. So we would like to not have to hard code that in types. So let's lose this. Let's keep this configuration inside greeter, which we need, and now that goes away as well.
Is there a reason you're not using like a default parameter for the struct itself, so for the greeting, to assign a default string?
Here, you mean?
Yeah, well, in line 6 actually, 6 and 7.
Yeah, well,
parameter for the string.
yeah, we can't actually assign any values here because we're defining a type. So we could have said, var default greeter, and assign it a struct literal that sets these fields, but we can't do that here. So suppose we had, that's now disappeared. Oh, that went well. Can I format this? Yes. Okay, there's no config anymore. So we might like a way to, we could imagine something like set greeting, something like this, right? That makes sense to us, doesn't it? But if we were going to do that, we could set the field directly instead of calling a method. Maybe we would like to do some validation on it, which is another issue. So we might need a method for that. But supposing we had some way of passing in things here where we could say greeter.new, greeter.with greeting, hola, let's say. Let's break this up a bit. Suppose we could do that, because that would be quite nice, wouldn't it? This doesn't exist yet, but we're sort of saying, and maybe we this looks quite nice from the user's point of view, doesn't it? But what does it mean in Go? So, like, what type of thing are we passing here? We don't know yet, do we? So the question is, could we do this? I think the answer is yes. And the name functional options kind of gives it away, doesn't it? We know they're actually going to be functions. So how would this work? So let's say, suppose, so Dave, I think this will be close to your heart because you're a functional programmer as well, aren't you? and we don't get the chance to do a whole lot of functional programming in Go, so you might appreciate this. Are you familiar with the idea of passing functions to other functions? I know you are, and perhaps you're trying to say that.
Dave, yes, I'm very familiar with that.
Yeah. So we can do that in Go, even though it's not a functional language as such. We can pass functions to things, and we've done that in previous code clubs. For example, last week we passed some functions to our crack functions to say here's a function which will generate new guesses for you, and here's another function which will tell you whether or not you guessed the password correctly. So we could do something similar here, couldn't we? We could pass a function which sets the greeting. What kind of function would that be? Do you think? Let's call it option, because that's what it is. So it's some kind of func. What would it need to take?
String value? Or?
Would it be a string though?
It needs to take a pointer to greet, wouldn't it?
Take a greeter?
Right, that sounds believable, doesn't it? In fact, because it's going to modify the greeter, to Thiago's point earlier on, it would need to take a pointer, wouldn't it? And that might be all we need. So say it's a function that takes a pointer to greeter and it just does something. What exactly? Go ahead.
Sorry. No, because I was thinking about it, because it's, I mean, could you set it up also as a method on greeter, since it's somewhat,
Yeah.
I guess this is just a different way, a cleaner way of doing it, as opposed to setting it up as a method.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we're saying we could just create the greeter object and then we could call methods on it to set things about it in a validating way, maybe. But it would be kind of neat if we could just do it all in one go. We could say, give me a new greeter with the following options. And we want some nice way to express those options. And maybe this is one way, so let's see if we can make it work. So let's suppose in new, we've got our default greeter, and we're going to take some options here, aren't we? Richard, perhaps you can remind me what we'd need to do if we say we want to take 0 or more options. Do we know a way to do that? Yeah, I heard ...
Oh yeah, that's right.
That's right. So we're saying we may not take any options at all, which is fine. We may take multiple options, which is also fine. Multiple config structs wouldn't have been so nice, would it? What would that even mean? If I'd said I take 0 or more configs, that's great for the 0 case, great for the 1 case, but if there's more than one config, I don't know which one to use. Should I try and merge them all together? Should one override another? It makes no sense. No one would ever want to supply multiple configs, would they? But they would want to supply multiple options, which is great. So what can I do with those options?
And loop over them, passing them the passed in option.
Yes, thank you, Brian. So I'm having a loop, you're saying. Let's range over the options and let's call each option O. What do I do with O?
You're going to call O so it takes a pointer to greeter. So you're going to
Yeah, I'm going to call it. That's right. And then I need to pass it something.
That doesn't greeter.
Yeah, suppose these all take a pointer to greeter, so let's just say that new returns a pointer to greeter. So I'm going to use the create a pointer to operator, the ampersand, and then I'll be returning my G at the end. So I'm going to need to name this slice. So this is opt, so I'm ranging over opts, and for each O, I call it with my pointer. Brian, does this look right to you?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
I have to write the
Yes, let's write one.
function.
So we're going to write our with greeting option, and we know what it takes, don't we?
String. String.
Yeah, we called it over here. So it takes a string, and what does it return?
A new greeter, pointer to a greeter.
Okay. And what do I do inside it?
Well, is this a? Oh, let's see. Well, it should take a string and a greeter. Is that accurate?
Actually, I don't need. We already have the greeter, don't we? Which is here. So we have options on it. So what I actually need to return is an option, isn't it? Because I'm passing options to new, so I need to supply my options here. And if I'm writing something like this, then this function call must return an option, mustn't it?
Yeah, you need to return an anonymous function that sets the configuration item you want to set.
Yeah, it's getting a little bit hairy, isn't it? Like even if we're comfortable with passing functions to functions and returning functions, starting to get a little bit difficult to understand, but we can think it through. So that's exactly right. So we're returning an option, so we can do that, can't we? We can return a func, which takes a greeter. We'll need to give it a name because we're going to use it. And what's that function going to do? Well, it's going to set the greeting. That's straightforward, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So this looks crazy, but there is method in the madness. So we're saying with greeting is a function you can call. You give it a string. It will return an option suitable for passing to greeter.new. What is that option? Well, it's a func which takes a pointer to greeter, as all options must do, and it sets the greeting on the greeter to the greeting. Really too much greeting going on here, but never mind. But you can see where that's going, can't you? And we can write with message in the same way, can't we? Very much the same idea. So this should actually run now, shouldn't it? Let's find out. Yep, that's working. So we sort of have a working functional options idea here, don't we? And I should say this idea goes back to Rob Pike, one of the Go designers. He wrote a blog post a long time ago called Self-Referential Functions and the Design of Options, which is a bit of a mouthful, but now we understand what he means, don't we? This is a self-referential function, if you like. It's a function that returns a function which refers to something. And Dave Cheney, who reliably writes really interesting and thought-provoking blog posts, wrote a blog post called Functional Options for Friendly APIs. And he's done a talk about this at various conferences along the same lines. And he's run through some of the options for options that we've talked about today. So I've stolen all Dave's ideas. Thanks for that. And so he basically looked at the different ways of passing options to things, and like us, he wasn't super happy with all of them. And he said, why not, since we can return funcs, you know, we can pass funcs and return funcs, why not implement options this way? Now, this looks mad. if we're not used to seeing it. But from the user's point of view, this is really nice, isn't it? I didn't have to create any structs. I didn't have to do any paperwork. I didn't have to supply options even though I didn't want to. If I'm happy with the defaults, then it's exactly the same as it was. But if I do want to supply them, this is a lovely way to supply them, isn't it? And I could imagine that maybe this function takes an option, you know. Maybe this takes a greeter.option and it adds it in. We could do that, couldn't we? Let's not, but we could. Now, so again, I'm kind of in two minds about this, maybe you are too. It looks nice over here, but over here, not so nice. Rakesh, what's your reaction to when you see code like this in a package?
It's too much to read in the start, but once you get through the benefits of writing this way, makes sense.
It's a bit confusing, isn't it? Just from the point of view of someone looking at the package, they're seeing funcs that return funcs, or funcs that take funcs and apply them. And there's even more sophisticated variations you could do on this. See Rob Pike's post for some examples of that. He envisages chaining the options so that each one returns the modified object, and then, you know, so they can successively modify the same thing maybe. But let's just keep it simple, chainy style for now. And this is the big disadvantage, isn't it? As Rakesh said, there's a lot to read. It's not instantly clear, especially if you're a relatively new gopher. It's not super clear to you. Every time I see a package that has functional options, I just look at this stuff and go, oh, it's making my head go round and round a bit. But,
John,
yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking like key takeaways here is to do it in a cleaner way, even though we walk through the options, and as you mentioned earlier, we could just create methods on the function. And would that be the cleaner way of writing this out if we had done it over so that it's not as messy on the reader.go side?
Well, it would absolutely make my life easier as the package writer. I wouldn't have to get my head around all this stuff. But as the user, I'm delighted with this.
Right.
Because I don't have to know how any of this works. That's sort of the point, isn't it?
So I guess it's the trade-offs then.
Yeah, I always want to trade off in favor of me doing more work and making life easier for the user. My packages would be more fun to use. People would be more likely to use them. And, you know, I use a lot more other people's packages than I write packages myself, so I would definitely be biased in favor of less paperwork, more flexible and friendly APIs, as Dave Cheney says. However, there is this downside of the complexity on the other side. So, Richard, how do you feel about this? Would you consider implementing options in this way for your Jekylizer, for example? Or is it just more trouble than you feel you need to go to?
I think given the premise, like if we're focusing on the user, then it makes sense, right? Because that package was really intended to abstract all of that complexity away and make it super simple for whoever's using it. So all they have to do is say, you know, go run and then call the package and then maybe pass in a flag, Jekyll and bundler or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would see the advantage of it, because I wouldn't want them getting into the weeds and stuff or having to provide more information than needed.
Yeah, Thibaut, from your point of view as a server writer, does this feel useful to you? And I mean, you decided against using this.
Yeah, because at the time I felt that it was too complicated for me
Yeah.
because when you stop for a few days and you get back to your code and you're seeing this, you're like, oh damn,
Yeah,
that's complicated.
that's right. Yeah,
And and I found a workaround with my functions. Well, in fact, I've got a listen and serve, and I've got another function that is listen and serve with custom port,
yeah,
where I let the user be able to customize the port on this function. So
yeah.
it's
That's
easier
something.
to me.
Yeah, we missed that out here while we were playing, didn't we? But we could have had something like greeter.new or greeter.new with greeting, new with message and greeting. Clearly, if we have more than 2 parameters, that just explodes. So it becomes
Yeah,
really awkward.
yeah.
With your server, you basically only have 1 or 2 options, don't you?
Yeah, it's always generally the port that you won't let that you will let the user customize.
Yeah.
So it's only one parameter, but if you have a lot of parameters to configure, it's becoming quickly a big mess.
Yeah, I think that puts it perfectly. So, you know, as with most things in Go, maybe the first time we discover something, we think, oh, this is really cool, I must use it. You know, like it's a solution looking for a problem, isn't it? And we will probably be writing a server or something at some point which has so many options of different types, and maybe they're nested structs and things, that this is actually a really beautiful and clean solution to it. But it's not free. Here's where you start paying. You start paying in complexity. And Thibaut's absolutely right. You know, if you don't need this level of optionability, I don't think you should use it just because, you know, we're not saying this is a best practice or anything. Sometimes even global config variables are fine. Sometimes a config struct is fine. Sometimes just setting fields on the object is alright. Sometimes variadic parameters are okay, but in the limit, for lots of options of complicated kinds, this feels like the thing we might reach for, doesn't it? In that situation. So it's nice to have these choices, and we definitely need to be able to understand this kind of thing when we see it in packages we're using, don't we? So now we do, I hope, or at least we've been introduced to it, haven't we? So it might be interesting to, you know, if you, those of you who've got projects that take options, you might like to just try. What does it look like if I take functional options? And I think that's probably the only way to be really comfortable with how they work, isn't it? Is to just actually do it yourself.
I'm probably going to totally abuse this for a while. So.
Yeah. So that's great. So I hope you'll try this out at some point, but I also hope you won't feel obliged to add it to every package. But it's there for us, and you can, you know, when you get comfortable with passing functions around and applying them as parameters and so forth, you could maybe imagine even more sophisticated uses for functional things than what we've done. So I'll leave you with that. We must wrap up, but it just remains for me to thank my guests. Thank you, Richard, Bryan, Dave, Josh, Rakesh, Thiago, Thibaut, and a shout out to Jumana and Tom. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
And I will see you next week for more clubbing. Bye bye for now.
See you.
Thanks,
Bye.
All right.